What if the woman they called a nobody, the one they mocked, belittled, and humiliated in front of the world, turned out to be the only one holding the key to a billion-dollar empire? They laughed at her clothes, her silence, her very existence, but they never asked who she truly was. And by the time the truth shattered their golden lies, it was already too late. Stay with us. Because what happens next will leave you questioning everything about loyalty, pride, and what it really means to be family. The iron gates of Sutton Estate loomed against the cloudy Charleston sky, their intricate black scrollwork a stark reminder of the legacy that pulsed through every inch of the sprawling grounds beyond. Harper Lane stepped from the battered cab that had dropped her at the front entrance, smoothing her simple navy dress with a trembling hand, the worn fabric a glaring contrast to the glittering gowns and polished tuxedos that filled the courtyard. She clutched a modest leather bag to her side as she made her way up the marble steps, each click of her worn heels swallowed by the heavy judging silence that fell over the gathering. Heads turned, gasps whispered through painted lips. Snickers echoed against the stone walls. "Is that the maid?" someone muttered loud enough to carry. "No, that's the ex-girlfriend." Another sneered, their voice dripping with false pity. "Probably sniffing around for scraps," a third said, laughing, their voice cutting deeper than any blade. The Sutton heirs, descendants of old Southern money, wore their cruelty like a second skin, their teeth flashing in practiced smiles as their phones slipped into their manicured hands, snapping photos, recording videos, crafting captions that would soon humiliate Harper to thousands beyond these walls. She walked through their gauntlet of disdain, with her head high each step, a battle against the shame clawing at her throat. She said nothing, as Simone Sutton, dazzling in a blood-red dress, looked Harper up and down and smirked, whispering to a cluster of cousins who erupted into muffled laughter. She said nothing when Preston Sutton, heir to one of the city's most powerful firms, made an exaggerated show of patting his pockets, joking loudly. "Better hide the silver folks, the help's here." Phones buzzed, screens flickered. By the time Harper reached the edge of the grand salon, where the will would be read, clips of her humiliation had already begun their slow crawl across the internet, the world beyond these walls quick to devour whatever cruelty the privileged decided to serve. But Harper remained silent, standing in the shadow of oil portraits and crystal chandeliers, her face a mask of quiet endurance, her eyes reflecting not anger, not fear, but something harder, sharper, something no amount of laughter could erase. She knew they thought they had already won. They didn't know how wrong they were. The storm of cruelty thickened as more heirs trickled into the grand salon, the murmur of disdain growing into an open roar. Simone Sutton, ever the queen of mockery, sashayed toward Harper with a mocking grin, a neon pink sticker between her perfectly manicured fingers. With a theatrical flourish, she slapped it onto Harper's worn leather bag, the words "charity case," blazing like a scarlet letter against the faded brown. Laughter exploded from the surrounding crowd, the sound sharp and vicious bouncing off the marble columns and dripping chandeliers. Cameras clicked, phones filmed. It wasn't enough to humiliate Harper in whispers anymore. Now they wanted evidence proof to share, to memorialize her shame for the world. "Nice handbag." Preston jeered, his voice laced with fake concern. "Where'd you get it? Thrift store clearance bin?" Another woman chimed in, loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe she thought dressing poor would get her a bigger cut of sympathy points. Someone else snorted, "Please, she's nothing but a leech clinging to the Sutton name." Judgments rained down like hailstones. Her plain dress, her simple sandals, the faint calluses on her hands, even the way she stood too quietly, too still among peacocks who mistook cruelty for charm. Harper Lane stood in the eye of the storm, her hands steady her breathing, even her eyes unfocused as if watching something far beyond the ornate cruelty around her. She could have defended herself. She could have shouted. She could have cried. But she did none of those things. Because Harper understood something that the crowd around her never would, real strength needs. No defense, real dignity can weather any storm. She waited patient and immovable as the venom dripped and the clock ticked closer to the moment that would silence them all. The heavy oak doors to the library creaked open again, a sharp rap of a gavel against the desk. The attorney stepped forward. The official reading of the will was about to begin, and the first domino was about to fall. The room fell into a brittle, expectant silence as Arthur Whitmore adjusted his glasses. his fingers slow and deliberate as he opened the heavy leather folder on the mahogany desk, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The Sutton heirs leaned forward with greedy anticipation, their smugness dripping from every glance, already calculating their shares, their new status, their inevitable ascension. Arthur cleared his throat, his voice steady, but cutting through the air like a blade. As per the final will and testament of Charles Alistair Sutton, he began, all assets, including all properties, stocks, businesses, and personal holdings, are hereby left in their entirety to a single heir. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. He continued, his voice firm, to his legal spouse, Mrs. Harper Lane Sutton. The words slammed into the crowd like a physical blow. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, and then chaos erupted. Chairs scraped violently against marble, voices rose in a crescendo of outrage. Impossible! Simone screamed, her face flushing an ugly shade of red. That tramp isn't even family. Preston lunged forward, slamming his fist against the table, sending papers flying. Where's the real will? This is a fraud! A setup, another cousin bellowed from the back. Phone snapped back up, not to mock Harper now, but to record the meltdown that had seized the room. The Sutton heirs turned their fury not just on Harper, but on Arthur himself, demanding proof, demanding explanations, their entitlement shrieking louder than any hurricane winds. But Harper stood still, her heart steady, her face unreadable. She had not needed to defend herself against their mockery, and she would not defend herself against their rage. She knew the truth was a tidal wave gathering strength behind the trembling walls of this house, and very soon it would wash everything false and rotten away. Arthur Whitmore adjusted his glasses again, unbothered by the uproar, and said quietly but firmly, "All necessary documentation will now be presented." The storm had only just begun. While the Sutton heirs raged and fumed, Harper Lane stepped forward with a quiet grace that silenced the room more effectively than any shouted command. She reached into her modest leather bag and with steady hands placed a stack of documents onto the polished mahogany table before Arthur Whitmore. The attorney, without a flicker of hesitation, spread them out one by one for all to see. First came the marriage certificate legally notarized, bearing the unmistakable signature of Charles Alistair Sutton. Gasps rippled through the air like cracks in ice. Then came handwritten letters, yellowed with age but clear and unmistakable. Filled with Charles's own words, professing his love, his trust, his intention to make Harper the sole guardian of his empire. Bank records followed, showing joint accounts opened years ago, long before any of the Sutton heirs had bothered to even visit the ailing patriarch. Finally, Arthur tapped on his tablet and the grand chandelier lights dimmed as a video flickered onto the massive screen above the fireplace. There, larger than life, was Charles Sutton himself, frail but smiling, standing beside Harper in a small sunlit courthouse. No grand ceremony, no audience, just a quiet exchange of vows captured on video, raw and undeniable. My heart. Charles's voice croaked through the speakers. My trust, my legacy, all of it belongs to you, Harper. The room watched in horrified, disbelieving silence as the two exchanged simple gold bands and kissed. When the video ended, there was no sound but the faint hiss of the projector cooling down. Simone staggered backward, her manicured nails digging into her designer clutch. Preston looked as if he might be sick. Others simply stood frozen, their faces drained of color, their carefully constructed world crumbling at their feet. No one could refute it now. No amount of wealth, influence, or vicious gossip could erase the truth burning before them. Harper Lane wasn't an outsider. She wasn't a parasite. She wasn't a mistake. She was Mrs. Harper Lane, Sutton, the lawful wife of Charles Sutton, and the rightful mistress of everything they had spent their lives clawing toward. The stunned silence in the salon pressed against the high vaulted ceilings, heavy as stone as Harper Lane. Calm as a gathering storm, pulled a slim black phone from her bag and tapped the screen. Instantly, a live stream flashed to life on the massive television above the fireplace. Gasps erupted as Charles Sutton's face filled the screen, not in memoriam, not in a somber tribute, but alive, breathing, smirking with the mischievous glint that had once built empires and crushed rivals. His voice raspy, yet strong, rolled through the room like a thunderclap. "Well, well," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "Looks like the masks are off at last." Several heirs stumbled back, one woman audibly choking on her own gasp. Simone clutched the back of a chair, her lips trembling. Preston muttered a curse under his breath, his mind already racing, trying to piece together how much of his carefully cultivated future had just gone up in smoke. Charles leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "To those of you who mourned my passing with crocodile tears while sharpening your knives," he said, his voice low and deadly, "you've revealed exactly who you are." He chuckled darkly, a sound that made the room's temperature seem to drop. "And to those who mocked, belittled, and spat on the woman who stood by my side without ever asking for anything in return, consider your inheritance revoked." Another gasp shuddered through the room, but Charles wasn't finished. He glanced off camera and smiled warmly. "Harper was the only one who knew the truth," he continued. "She helped me plan this test. She agreed to endure humiliation, cruelty, and betrayal just so I could see clearly who deserved to carry the Sutton name forward." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink like anchors into the hearts of every trembling heir in the room. "Harper Lane, Sutton isn't just my wife," he said. "She is my legacy, she is my choice, and she is the future of everything I built." The screen froze on Charles's unyielding expression, then faded to black, leaving behind a cavernous silence more deafening than any scream. Phones dropped, papers slid from limp fingers. Every scheme, every whispered insult, every calculated betrayal collapsed like a house of cards. And at the center of the storm stood Harper Lane, still in her simple navy dress, her face serene, her eyes burning with a quiet fire that no amount of money, no amount of cruelty could ever extinguish. The Sutton dynasty hadn't just changed hands. It had been reborn. The silence after Charles's final words hung in the grand salon, like a noose tightening around every gilded neck. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had cracked open under the weight of a truth too heavy to bear. Then, with a deliberate slowness that sent fresh chills rippling through the room, Charles Sutton's live image flickered back onto the screen, this time his expression colder, stripped of the warmth that had once sheltered his so-called family. "Let it be known," he said, each word landing like a hammer. "Blow effective immediately, I am severing all personal and financial ties with those who revealed their greed and cruelty toward my wife, Harper Lane Sutton." He lifted a hand and began to name them, each name a death sentence. Simone Sutton cut, off Preston Whitmore. Sutton cut, off Ethan Caldwell. Sutton cut, off Marjorie Lane. Sutton cut, off you will receive nothing, not a dollar, not a deed, not a legacy. Your access to Sutton Properties accounts and privileges is hereby revoked permanently. The finality of it hit harder than any shouted curse. Simone gasped as if struck, her knees buckling as she clutched desperately at the edge of a chaise. Preston staggered backward, his phone slipping from his trembling hand and shattering against the marble floor. Ethan cursed under his breath, fists clenched in helpless rage. Marjorie, pale as paper, simply sat down hard, her designer skirt pooling around her like a fallen flag. Charles's voice lowered into a tone of ice. "You chose to wear masks of loyalty while sharpening your daggers. You chose greed over family, cruelty over kindness, and now you will reap what you have sown." The screen went black again, leaving only the sound of scattered, ragged breathing. Security guards in crisp black uniforms entered the room without ceremony, flanking the now disgraced heirs. Simone protested first, screeching about her rights, about her lawyer, about unfair treatment. But it was too late. Preston tried to threaten. Ethan tried to bribe Marjorie, tried to weep. None of it mattered. They were escorted out one by one, their cries growing fainter down the long marble hallways of a kingdom they no longer owned. As they stumbled into the blinding afternoon sun, reporters and photographers, tipped off by anonymous calls, were already waiting. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes, microphones jabbed forward like knives. "Simone, how does it feel to lose everything?" "Preston, do you regret mocking Mrs. Sutton?" Their faces, once carefully curated for likes and followers, twisted into grotesque masks of rage and humiliation. Within hours, their social media accounts were flooded with ridicule. Brand deals dropped them, publicists cut ties, invitations to galas and fundraisers evaporated. Their names, once whispered with envy in Charleston's highest circles, became the butt of cruel jokes across the country. Their downfall was not just total, it was spectacular, and it was irreversible. Back inside the Sutton estate, Harper Lane stood quietly near the grand fireplace, the warmth from the hearth brushing against her fingertips. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she simply breathed slow. Deep, steady as the walls that had once been used to cage her, now rose around her like a fortress. She had endured the worst of their hatred. She had weathered the cruelty they believed would destroy her. And now it was they who lay broken and forgotten outside the gates, while Harper Lane Sutton, the woman they had mocked as a charity case, stood at the heart of an empire reborn. As the dust of the reckoning settled over Sutton Estate, a different kind of silence took hold, heavier but somehow cleaner, as if the rot had finally been scraped away, leaving only what was real. Harper Lane remained near the grand fireplace, her figure framed by the soft glow of the afternoon light spilling through the stained glass windows. At her side now stood three figures, three souls who had not mocked, who had not sneered, who had not recorded her shame for sport. There was Caroline Sutton, a quiet cousin who had offered Harper a glass of water and a whispered, "You're welcome here," even when the others jeered. There was Henry Sutton, an aging uncle who had tipped his hat respectfully when Harper arrived, standing when no one else had moved. And there was Elise Whitmore, a distant relative who had simply sat in silent solidarity, refusing to join the chorus of cruelty. They had not done it for a reward. They had done it because decency was woven into their bones. When the last of the unworthy were escorted off the property and the echoes of their outrage faded into the hills, Charles Sutton's voice returned, booming through the estate's ancient speaker system. Family, he said, his voice rough with age but clear with conviction, is not determined by blood, nor by name, nor by the size of one's bank account. Family is proven when no one is looking. Family is loyalty when it costs you everything. And today, I name Caroline Henry and Elise as my family, my true heirs in spirit, if not in blood. Gasps rippled through the remaining onlookers, but no one dared speak. These three, overlooked and underestimated for so long, now stood as pillars of the new Sutton legacy. To them would go not just pieces of the estate, but places at the table, trust, respect, the things the others had traded away for vanity and greed. Harper turned to each of them, her throat tight with emotion, her hand finding Charles's gnarled but steady one. Their kindness had not gone unnoticed. In a world that had sharpened its knives against anyone who dared be different, these few had chosen to put their weapons down. And now their names would be remembered, not in shame, but in honor. Kindness had prevailed, dignity had survived. And the Sutton name, once a monument to arrogance, would be rebuilt on something far stronger. Quiet loyalty, humble strength, and the unshakable courage to stand beside the right person when it mattered most. The Grand Salon, once a glittering temple of pride and pretense, now lay in quiet disarray, echoes of shattered ambition lingering in the golden afternoon light. Yet in the center of it all, where wealth and bloodlines had failed, stood Harper Lane and Charles Sutton side by side, unshaken. His hand, weathered and strong, despite the passage of years, rested lightly over hers. A silent vow, stronger than any document or inheritance. Harper's eyes swept the room, the toppled chairs, the discarded champagne glasses, the crushed remnants of false grandeur, and for the first time since she set foot in Sutton Estate, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, freely, as if shedding a weight she had carried alone for far too long. She didn't look at the piles of legal deeds now bearing her name. She didn't glance toward the heavy keys laid out neatly on velvet cushions, representing ownership of homes, yachts, and fortunes stretching beyond the horizon. None of it mattered. None of it ever had. She turned to Charles, her voice low but steady, carrying the kind of strength that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. "I never wanted the estate," she said. "I never wanted the titles or the riches." She squeezed his hand gently, her heart written clearly across her face. "I only wanted the truth, and I only ever wanted you." Charles's weathered features softened a rare crack in the stoic mask he wore to the world. "And you have both," he said hoarsely, "forever." In that moment, standing amid the ruins of greed and broken pride, Harper Lane reclaimed more than just dignity. She reclaimed the sanctity of love that expects nothing, that endures humiliation without bending, that stands tall even when the whole world tries to bury it. It wasn't marble floors or gold chandeliers that gave life meaning. It wasn't family names engraved in granite. It was this bond between two souls who refused to be defined by anyone else's measure of worth. As they turned to leave the crumbling hall behind them, Harper Lane and Charles Sutton walked forward, not as survivors of betrayal, but as victors of something infinitely rarer, the triumph of loyalty, the triumph of love unbought and undestroyed. And though the estate would be rebuilt in time, its true foundation had already been laid that day in something far stronger than stone: truth, dignity, and a love that could not be broken. The days that followed moved slowly like the settling of dust after a long, violent tempest. The once bustling corridors of Sutton Estate grew still emptied of the hollow footsteps and hollower laughter that had once polluted its marble floors. The chandeliers no longer trembled under the weight of whispered betrayals. The velvet curtains no longer hid glances thick with greed. What remained was silence, not heavy with tension, but rich with renewal, like the earth after a cleansing rain. On the wide stone terrace overlooking the rolling green hills, Harper Lane and Charles Sutton sat side by side, wrapped in the kind of quiet that only comes after the last battle has been fought and won without violence. Charles leaned heavily on his cane, his body frailer than it had once been, but his spirit stronger, lighter. Harper sat close, their shoulders brushing her simple cotton dress, fluttering lightly in the soft Carolina breeze. No jewels adorned her. No crown weighed down her brow, and yet she wore more nobility in that moment than any title could have given. Before them, the estate stretched out not as a monument to wealth, but as a promise of rebirth. The hills, once veiled by arrogance, now shimmered in the golden light of a forgiving sun, the grass whispering against the wind, as if singing a hymn for second chances. From the highest windows of the mansion, beams of sunlight poured through, casting long, warm paths across the polished floors, in no longer illuminating false airs, but rather blessing a new beginning carved from truth. Harper turned to Charles, their eyes meeting without the need for words. Everything had been stripped away, the pretense, the ambition, the cruelty. What remained between them was pure, unshakable, a connection built not in the absence of storms, but because of them. As the wind stirred the tall oaks beyond the estate walls, it carried with it the faintest echo of laughter, not cruel or mocking, but free and genuine. A sound that marked not the end of a legacy, but the beginning of something far greater. Peace rooted in dignity, in loyalty, and in love, that had withstood every attempt to tear it apart. The Sutton estate would heal, and so would they. Together always. As the sun dipped behind the Carolina hills, casting the Sutton estate in a final wash of gold, a quiet truth settled over the land. A truth greater than any fortune, stronger than any name carved in stone. It wasn't power that had endured. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't the polished lies so many had fought to protect. It was dignity. It was love. It was loyalty. Proven in silence and hardship when no one was watching. Harper Lane's story wasn't about a woman who won an estate. It wasn't about scandal or inheritance. It was about something far rarer in a world obsessed with appearances. It was about the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind of honor that stands even when the world around it crumbles. As you leave this story behind, remember it, share it, carry it with you into a world that too often forgets. Teach your children, remind your friends, whisper it to yourself on days when kindness feels like weakness and honesty feels like a burden, because the measure of a life isn't how loudly you are celebrated when you win. It's how quietly you stand for what is right when no one believes in you. In the end, the greatest legacy you can leave isn't fortune or fame, it's the simple, unbreakable truth. Dignity is priceless, and love, true love, needs no permission to endure. They believed money made them untouchable. They believed cruelty made them powerful. But they forgot the oldest truth of all. Storms don't announce themselves. They rise quietly and destroy everything of false in their path. Harper Lane didn't shout. She didn't strike back with fists. She stood and the world around her crumbled. Today maybe we all need to remember, in a world obsessed with power, the strongest thing you can be is kind, and the richest thing you can hold is your dignity.